And we're back for another episode of the Rebellion podcast. All right, today's episode, stats, and stats. Oh, and also some more stats. All right, so I'm going over the statistical leaders of individual basketball players in all the major categories. And I'm not just talking points, blocks, rebounds, assists. I'm talking advanced stats. There's a lot of calculations that some nerds come up with of really assessing how good a player was statistically, like mathematical calculations that sometimes make your head spin. I don't necessarily need to know how to calculate everything, but I can read pretty well. I learned to read, in elementary school, so I can read off some really cool stats for you guys. So let's figure out who the best players were in UNLV men's basketball history in all the major statistical categories, and there's a bunch of them. So I'm not going to say the top 10 in each one. Otherwise, this episode would be way too long and, frankly, a little boring. So I'm just going to say the top 3 in each statistical category. And if the statistical category is like, well, what does that mean? I'm going to discuss it or go over it. All right. So let's start off with assists. Okay. This is total assists in school history. I'm going to count down 3 through 1. Okay. And then before I move on to the next category, right? So total assists, school history. Number 3 is Danny Tarkanian with 289. Number 2, Greg Anthony, 310. And number 1, Mark Wade, 406. I need to do more research on Mark Wade, watch more video on him, read articles or something, because it's just one of those names I've always heard, and I just don't know that much about him other than he was a really good player for us. So yeah, Mark Wade has the most assists in school's history. All right, assist percentage. Now, this is when we're getting into advanced stats, right? So assist percentage is a basketball stat that shows how often a player assists their teammate while on the court. Okay, it's calculated by dividing the number of assists a player has by the number of made field goals by their teammate while they were on the court. Okay, essentially, just to put it in more simpler terms, This is supposed to give a more advanced, in-depth kind of analysis of how good a player was at getting assists. All right? Because if you think about it, if you have a player who plays 38 minutes per game and they average 5 assists per game, there might not necessarily be a better passer than someone who plays 12 minutes a game and averages 3 assists per game. All right? It's more advanced than that, but that's why we have to go into a little bit more in depth with these stats, right? Okay, so assist percentage all time. Number 3, Marcus Banks with 32.8. Number 2, Anthony Marshall, 32.9. Wow, Marshall, that's awesome. I always said he wasn't a true point guard and he was more of a scorer, slasher, defender, but clearly he was a better passer than my memory serves, so that's awesome. And then number 1, Jarrell Bassingame. He played in 2003, 2004, 37.1, best assist percentage in school history. All right, let's go assists per game. How many assists they average per game? Number 3, Mark Dickel, 9 assists per game. I think when I did my top 20 most talented players, I put in the last 20 years, I put Dickel in there because of how good of a passer he was. So he was 3rd all time in assists per game. Number 2, Danny Tarkanian, 9.2. And number 1, Mark Wade, again, the famous Mark Wade. He played 1986 and 87. He averaged 10.7 assists per game. What a stud. All right, let's go with blocks. So this is total blocks. Kem Birch, number 1, 124. That is impressive because he only played 2 seasons. Did he really have the most blocks in school history only playing 2 seasons? Huh, interesting. I would not think that. You would think there'd be some athletic stud that played in the 80s that played all 4 years. So, yeah, Kem Birch, wow, 124 blocks, number 1. I forgot to count down on this one. So, number 3 was Joel Anthony with 109. Number 2, Keon Clark with 112. And then, yeah, Birch is coming in at number 1. All right, now block percentage. Okay, block percentage. So, block percentage is similar as I was talking about with assist percentage. It just has to do with the amount of time you're on the court versus how many shots the opponents are putting up. Basically, how valuable you are as a shot blocker, like what percentage of the shots you're blocking, that sort of thing, right? So Number 3, Christian Wood, 8.2. Number 2, Good Luck Okanobo, 10.7. Good Luck was a good natural shot blocker. You know, I did put him on my list of the most disappointing players in UNLV basketball history, but I can't take that away from him. The guy was a very natural shot blocker. Such a talent, man. Like, why he isn't a multi-millionaire basketball player right now is it's just sad. And then number 1, block percentage, Kem Birch. Wow, 10.9. So Kem Birch, statistically, is the best shot blocker in school's history. All right, blocks per game. Who averaged the most blocks per game? Number 3, Joel Anthony, his senior year, 2.9. Number 2, Kem Birch, 2013-2014. He averaged 3.8 blocks per game. And number 1, Keon Clark, 1996-97. He averaged 3.9 blocks per game. God, Clark was so talented. Such a talented dude. All right, box plus minus. So if you don't know what plus minus means, it's pretty simple. They just calculate what was the score when you went in the game, what was the score when you went out of the game. Essentially, did the team do better or worse when you were in the game? It's a pretty good stat that shows how valuable you are to your team, right? Because sometimes we have guys that don't do anything exciting. They don't put up big numbers, so people don't think they're good. And then you don't realize because they're doing a lot of little things that you don't see in the stats that don't jump out at you. Okay, the average casual fan doesn't notice a lot of this stuff. Maybe you're setting really good screens. Maybe you're running the offense to perfection. Maybe you're talking on offense and talking on defense extremely well. You're diving for loose balls. There's so many things you could be doing to impact the game positively that the average fan doesn't see and it doesn't show up in a stat book. But what can show up in a stat book is your plus minus, right? So plus minus, number 3 all time, Anthony Bennett. Wow. I knew he was valuable. Wasn't that shocking, but he got criticized a lot by people for not playing any defense, but he was still clearly very valuable despite that, because he's number 3 all time and plus minus. Number 2, Kem Birch. Wow. Kem Birch was very valuable for us, wasn't he? And number 1, Trayvon Willis. You know, I don't talk about Trayvon a lot. He was our best player from 2009 and 2011, and he was just so solid. Just played really hard defense. He was smart. I just remember he was so good at getting the free throw line, and he was money. It was such a valuable skill, being really good at getting the free throw line and then just knocking them down. It just makes your offense so valuable. So wow, Trayvon Willis, number 1 all time plus minus. Very cool. All right, now we're going defensive plus minus. Okay, so what was the score from the other team when you went in the game, and what was the score of the other team when you went out of the game? Number 3, Anthony Marshall. I said this guy's a lockdown defender, and he's one of the greatest defenders ever. I should do a separate podcast of top 10 defensive players in UNLV basketball history, and these stats will really help me with that. Okay, it would be hard to do that just off of my memory. Number 2, Kem Birch. We're hearing his name a lot. And number 1, wow, Justin Hawkins. I'll be damned. You know, I call this when I was in my episode where I talked about the most disappointing players ever, and I talked about Caton Reinhardt. I talked about how even though the dude played no defense and took a lot of bad shots, he got minutes over Justin Hawkins, who was a lockdown defender. I said that. You can go back and listen to it. Here you go. Justin Hawkins, number 1 defensive plus minus of all time in school's history. That's impressive. All right, defensive rebounds total. Number 3, Shakur Houston. Wow, that's awesome. Number 2, Mike Moser. And number 1, Larry Johnson. Very cool. All right, defensive rebound percentage. Okay, so rebound percentage. Rebound percentage is a statistic that measures a team or player's ability to recover missed shots. It is calculated by dividing the number of rebounds collected by a team or player by the total number of missed shots. Okay, so basically how valuable you are as a rebounder. Okay, it's more specific. It's more specific, or defensive rebounder rather. So it's more specific to how good you were of a defensive rebound, more depth than just what the numbers you were put up. Okay, number 3, Steven Zimmerman. A little bit surprising. I knew he put up good rebounding numbers, but I didn't think it would be that high. So that's very cool for Zim. Number 2, Mike Moser. And number 1, Royce Ham. Royce Ham was a really good rebounder. We could have really used Royce Ham in Kevin's second year because that team just didn't have any rebounders. All right, defensive win shares. Okay, so I'm going to talk about win shares real quick because these were a little bit more confusing to me. So defensive win shares estimates the number of wins by a player contributed on defensive possessions. Okay, so the number of wins a player contributes on defensive possessions. So how many games you're winning, essentially, based off of your defense. And let's take a look at that one. Defensive win shares. Number 3, Rene Rougeau. Not surprising at all. I talked about him a lot, of one of the most surprisingly awesome players in school's history. And he did that. He just did the little things. And I have all the statistics to back it up. Rene Rougeau, number 3. Number 2, Keon Clark. Number 1, Rene Rougeau. Oh, I was like, why is he on here twice? Because it goes by per season. That's why. Okay, so 2007, 2008, Rene Rougeau, when they went to the NCAA tournament, beat Kent State. That was Rene's best season. That season was the best win shares of all time on defense. Pretty awesome. Okay, let's go into field goals. All right, number 3, all-time field goals made. Eddie Owens, the legend Eddie Owens. Number 2, Larry Johnson. And number 1, Armin Gilliam, 359 field goals made. All right, 3-point field goals made. Who made the most three-pointers in UNLV basketball history? Number 3, Anderson Hunt. Not surprised at all to see his name on there. The guy was a sharpshooter. Probably should have had an NBA career. He was a little undersized, though. But love Anderson Hunt. What a legend. Number 2, Gerald Patio. I apologize if there's any old heads listening to this. That was I said Gerald. It's Gerald. That's a big Gerald fan. I apologize for not knowing how to pronounce his name. But the guy deserves better than that because he was number 2 all-time field goals made. And number 1, Freddie Banks. Freddie Banks. Freddie Banks Jr. I actually went to school with. I won't claim that we were like great friends or anything, but I played basketball with him a little bit. I've talked to him before a few times. So, yeah, just a random useless information for you. All right, 3-point field goal attempts. So who took the most three-pointers in the history of the school? Number 3, Anderson Hunt, 263. Number 2, Gerald Padeo, 282. And number 1, Freddie Banks. Okay, so the same guys that made the most took the most. It's funny is like you would think today's day and age is when the players would have taken the most three-pointers, because the way the game's changed with analytics and Steph Curry had it to where three-point shooting was so valuable. So that shows that back then we were above our time. We were before the analytical era, putting up lots of threes. That shows how brilliant Tark was. All right, three-point field goal percentage. So I don't know what the medium attempts were. So I can't. It's hard to justify like where you should be on this, but so that part I don't know. But still, let's look at it. Number 3, David Jenkins. All right, wow. So I remember when I was talking about David Jenkins on one of the podcasts, I was like, he wasn't as good of a shooter as we thought he'd be. But according to this, he's number 3 all time. I really got to figure out what the minimum attempts are because I'm pretty sure Justin Webster shot like 46% like 2 years ago. He shot lights out, and I don't see his name anywhere on here. So I'm thinking the minimum is like a lot of attempts. And then number 2, Gerald again. I'm just gonna call him Gerald because I'm not quite sure how to say his last name. Gerald is the man shooting the ball. And then number 1, Freddie Banks. Dang, Freddie Banks, the Steph Curry of UNLV basketball. All right, field goal attempts. Who took the most? Number 3, Freddie Banks with 590. Number 2, Armin Gilliam with 598. Number 1, Jim Baker with 616. Field goal percentage. Number 3, Shakur Houston, 64%. Number 2, Jarvis Bass Knight, about 65%. And then number 1, Larry Johnson at 66%. Larry Johnson, what a stud. God, he was good. All right, free throws. So total free throws. Number 3, Armin Gilliam at 185. Number 2, the man, Isaiah J.R. Ryder, 195. And then number 1, Larry Johnson. Yeah, Johnson was just a beast, and you couldn't contain him down low, so he just got to the free throw line. Free throw attempts. Number 3, Armin Gilliam, 254. Number 2, Larry Johnson, 262. Number 1, Otis Allison. Wow, that goes way back. That's before Tark. 1969, 1970, 268 free throw attempts. The man, Otis, just knew how to get to the free throw line. What a stud. All right, free throw percentage. Number 3, Delron Johnson, 2001, 2002. He's 85% or 86, about 86%. Wow. He was a big man, and he was one of the best free throw shooters in the school's history. And then number 2, Delron Johnson, again, 2002-2003 season, 87%. See, I knew when I put Delron Johnson on my most talented players ever, I knew what I was doing, because he was extremely skilled at 6'10". He should have been an NBA player. My guess is he just wasn't athletic enough. All right, so number 1, the legend, the man, the myth, the legend, Robert Smith, 92% free throw shooter. Wow. All right, minutes played. Who played the most minutes in school's history? Okay, so we have a 4-way tie at second place. That's interesting that many players played the exact same minutes, but that's Larry Johnson, Armin Gilliam, Anthony Jones, and number 1, Freddie Banks, 1,307 minutes. All right, minutes played per game. Number 3, Marcus Banks, 36.1 minutes. Number 2, Sidney Green, 36.1 minutes. Number 1, Mark Dickel, 36.6 minutes. Yeah, that takes incredible stamina to get that many minutes. Dedon Thomas Sr. was number 4. I got to think Dedon Thomas Jr., I don't know how updated these stats are, but I thought he played around 35 minutes a game last season, which was so impressive for his age. All right, offensive box score plus minus. All right, what the plus minus was of when you went on the game on the offensive end, right? Number 3, Trayvon Willis at 5.1. Number 2, Anthony Bennett, 6.1. Number 1, Bryce Hamilton, 7.5. Wow, that's awesome numbers right there for Bryce. I called it. I was like, this dude is an offensive legend. Offensive rebounds, number 3, Roscoe Smith. God, he was a great rebounder. I remember the stats he would put up. Oh, wow, same season, Kem Birch at number 2, 131 offensive rebounds. Yeah, we had the 2 of the best rebounders in the history of UNLV basketball on the same team that year. And unfortunately, the team was not good at all, which is just, don't get me started. Number 1, Larry Johnson, 151. Offensive rebound percentage. Ooh, Mbake Zhang, number 3. Number 2, Roscoe Smith. And number 1, Kem Birch. All right, offensive win shares. Have I talked about win shares yet? I think I talked about, yeah, I remember right. I did. Okay, so offensive win shares estimates the number of wins a player contributes on offensive possessions. Okay, and then I talked about defensive win shares. So the sum of players' offensive win shares and defensive win shares is their total win share. All right, win share per 40 minutes is another statistic that can be used to compare players from different teams. All right, because I'm going to eventually go over total win shares, so I wanted to make that clear. Okay, so offensive win shares. Number 3, Odarte Blankson. God, another really good player I haven't talked about much on the other podcast episodes. Number 2, Trayvon Willis. Number 1, Marcus Banks. Player efficiency rating. Okay, this is a really good statistic. How efficient a player was, meaning they took really good shots and they made a really good percentage of it. All right, so these are very valuable stats, right? So number 3, Caleb Boone from this past season. Wow, 25.6. Dang, that kind of makes me wish we didn't lose him and he was coming back. Well, that's pretty impressive. He had the 3rd best player efficiency rating of all time. Number 2, Kem Birch, and number 1, Anthony Bennett. God, Bennett was so talented. Anyone that tries to say Bennett wasn't one of the most talented players in school history, you need to just look at these stats, because he was dominating all these stats without even trying. He didn't even care that much. That shows how talented he was. All right. Personal fouls, George Ackles, 125. Number 2, Larry Johnson, 128. Number 1, Richie Adams, 129. Total points. Okay, Isaiah Ryder, number 3, 814. Number 2, Larry Johnson, 822. Number 1, Armin Gilliam, 903. Where's Bryce Hamilton at? 697. You know what I thought of? If Bryce Hamilton came back and played his COVID year and then averaged like 20 a game, he might have been all-time leading scorer. Now, it probably wouldn't have really count it. There'd be an asterisk next to it because he played 5 seasons instead of 4. But one of those seasons still like doesn't really count because you only played half the games because of COVID. But just a side note. All right, points per game. Number 3, Eddie Owens averaged 23.4. Wow. Number 2, Bob Florence, 24.6. And number 1, Isaiah Ryder. Wow, he averaged 29.1 points per game. God, he was a superstar. He killed it in the NBA, too, for a little bit. God, Isaiah Ryder was so good. Steals, all-time steals leader. Number 3, Greg Anthony in 1988-89 had 85 steals. Number 2, Marcus Banks, 91 steals. Again, shows how talented Marcus Banks was because we remember how unstoppable he was on offense, but he also had the second most steals in school history. And then Greg Anthony, 106. Dang. I need to come back to these stats next when I want to make my statistics for the greatest players ever. Steal percentage, number 3, Justin Hawkins in 2011-2012. Number 2, Justin Hawkins, 2012-2013. Man, Justin Hawkins was so good on defense. Man, I wish he would have had more minutes. Number 1, Patrick McCaw. Dang, I called that. He just had this really incredible skill. He just knew how to stick his hand in there when a player would cross over at the right moment, at the exact right time to poke it away and get that steal. It was a very valuable skill he had. Okay, and then there you go. He had the best steal percentage of all time. Steal per game, Sean Marion, 2.5. Number 2, Greg Anthony, 2.7. And number 1, Marcus Banks, 2.8. All right, turnovers. The most turnovers in the history of UNLV basketball. Number 3, Marcus Banks, 126. Number 2, Sidney Green, 131. Number 1, Michael Burns, 132. Turnover percentage. So this is more in depth for turnover, like getting into turnovers, right? Number 3, Dedon Thomas Sr., 33.1. Number 2, Mark Wade in 86-87 at 36.0. And number 1, Mark Wade in 85-86, 39.4. You know what? When you get the most assists ever, there's a good chance you're going to have the most turnovers ever because you're out there just passing the ball like it's nobody's business. Total rebounds, school history. Larry Johnson in the 90-91 season, he had 380. Jim Baker in 72-73 had 424. And then number 1, Larry Johnson, the national championship season, in 89-90, he had 457 total rebounds. All right, just a few more categories, guys, and then we are all set. Okay, so total rebound percentage. Number 3, Mike Moser, 19.6. Number 2, Roscoe Smith, 19.7. Number 1, Royce Ham, 21.1. God, Royce Ham was so good. If Royce Ham was better offensively, he would be in the NBA right now. He'd be in the NBA right now, and he would have been, Mountain West Player of the Year because he just struggled to finish around the rim. But God, he was so good on defense, and he was such a good rebounder. I would love to have Royce Ham on this upcoming team. Okay, total rebounds per game. Number 3, Lewis Brown, 11.7. Number 2, Sidney Green, 11.9. Number 1, Jim Baker, 15.1. True shooting percentage. All right, so what is that? In basketball, true shooting percentage is a statistic that measures how efficiently a player shoots the ball. It's calculated by taking half the points scored and dividing it by the sum of the field goals attempted plus 0.475 times the free throws attempted. Okay, again, that's that nerd stuff that is essentially essentially looking at just how effective you were at making the shots. Okay, it takes all different types of things into account, right? So it's more in depth than just did the ball go in or not, right? Number 3, Jarvis Bass-Knight. Number 2, Larry Johnson. Number 1, Larry Johnson. See, Larry Johnson is like in almost every statistical category. You add that with the fact that he won the national championship. He was the number 1 pick in the draft. He's just undoubtedly the greatest Rebel ever, okay? Usage percentage. Wow. This is really interesting. The top 5 are all Kevin Kruger players. All the coaches we've had in the history of UNLV, all the different teams we've had, going all the way back to the late 60s, the top 5 players in usage percentage in the history of our school, all Kevin Kruger players. I don't like that. That means he has an offense where one guy is doing everything. That's not what I want. I want an offense where multiple guys are contributing. So, and I know Dedon Thomas Jr. had the ball in his hands a lot. Is he on here? Okay, he's not on here. All right, but yeah, that is crazy. So number 5, Donovan Williams. Number 4, Bryce Hamilton in 2019-2020. Number 3, Bryce Hamilton in 2020-21. Number 2, Elijah Harkless in 2022-2023. Number 1, Bryce Hamilton in 2021-2022. So Bryce Hamilton, 3 of the top 4 seasons ever for usage percentage, which means that's the ball is in their hands almost the entire time on offense. If you don't know what usage percentage means, wow, that is crazy. That's the craziest stat I've seen so far. Is that all Kevin Kruger players at the top of that list? Okay, win shares. I talked about win shares. Number 3, Rene Rougeau, 5.7. Number 2, Sean Marion, 6.0. Number 1, Keon Clark, 6.3. You know, if I had to put a team together, the greatest UNLV team ever, and I had to do a whole roster, I would look at a lot of these stats, okay, and then try and fit those in somehow. Try and use math to create the best team ever. All right, last category, win shares per 40 minutes. Okay, number 3, Rene Rougeau. Number 2, Sean Marion. Number 1, Keon Clark. So just a few takeaways from analyzing all these statistics. First of all, Larry Johnson was just the man. He was just all-around best player ever. The most talented players I've noticed seem to be on a lot of these lists. Marcus Banks, Anthony Bennett, Sean Marion, Keon Clark. They just clearly talent tends to reflect in stats, and in addition to stats, the advanced stats. Okay? Kem Birch was extremely talented. He was a McDonald's All-American. He played in the NBA. He's more talented than people remember. I'm telling you that right now. And this also proves it. Okay? According to this, he was the best shot blocker we've ever had, which, God, Rice had so much talent. He had so much talent, and the best we could get was a 5-seed first-round exit. It's depressing. So, all right, that's it for today, guys. Definitely a lot of interesting things when I looked into these stats. I'm eventually going to make a greatest players ever rankings. I'm going to make my own because I know there's ones that came out, but I think there's a lot of bias in those. I'm going to make mine, which I'm going to try and make it as least biased as possible. And I'm going to reference a lot of these advanced stats to help me make that list. All right, guys, have a good one. Bye.